advances the slides. Yeah, good.
Just need to point it at the screen, I think.
Yep.
Right, we'll get started, I think. Okay, can we make a start, please? Has everyone found a seat? Thank you. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce Eliot Coleman today, who has just flown in from America, arrived last night, a little jet lagged, I believe. I just wanted to say a few words about Eliot before I hand over to him, and then we'll take some questions at the end, if that's okay. So 1 year ago on this stage, I had the privilege of introducing Perrine Hervé-Grière, who gave us a wonderful talk about La Ferme de Bec-Éloin, the beautiful and productive farm that she has set up with her husband Charles in Normandy. Perrine and Charles have drawn inspiration from many sources, but their greatest source of inspiration was Eliot Coleman. And I quote from Perrine and Charles's wonderful book, Miraculous Abundance, "No doubt about it, for us the most significant book of recent years was the Winter Harvest Handbook by Eliot Coleman. A masterpiece, this book caused a mini earthquake that had a profound impact on our farm. As soon as we received it, we spent hours gazing at pictures of greenhouses and gardens, blown away by the beauty that emerges from Coleman's four-season farm, where the layout of crops touches perfection. We devoured the text, clear and full of useful information. Over the years, the book became wrinkled, stained with earth, covered with annotations and calculations. Coleman is one of the best growers in the world." I'm sure that many of you here today will also have been influenced by Eliot, one of the pioneers of the organic farming movement. Eliot is an extreme sports enthusiast, passionate about rock climbing, mountaineering, kayaking, and always in search of challenges. Pushing limits is his obsession, and it is with these qualities and attitude that he is able to develop his unique farming approach. However, getting to the top of the mountain is not the part that matters, says Eliot. He goes on, "We climbers are always seeking the elegance of the way. The dullest part of climbing a mountain is getting to the top. The fascinating part is trying to figure out how to get up the cliff or down the river. The nice thing about farming is that the mountain doesn't have a top. There's always some way to figure out how to do it better, and that's been utterly entrancing." He began his farming adventure in the late 1960s and set himself perhaps his greatest challenge yet, to transform an area of forest in Maine with no soil and a pH of 4.3, where the thermometer regularly drops to minus 25 degrees Celsius, into one of the most productive, organic, bio-intensive microfarms in the world. The yield at Four Season Farm is such that the 8,000 square meters of cultivated land provides wages for 2 permanent and 4 seasonal workers in the summer, in addition to Eliot and his wife Barbara. But more than that, it has been an inspiration for a generation of small-scale organic farmers around the world. Behind the technique is an ethic of sharing and generosity. Eliot has designed many handheld tools over the years, none of which are patented. He has sold plots of land to friends and colleagues for barely anything, in the spirit of the low price he himself paid 50 years ago. He has shared his wisdom and techniques in his seminal books, The New Organic Grower, recently updated for its 30th anniversary edition, and the Winter Harvest Handbook. Underneath their farm are the words, "Real farming, real food." I'm delighted that Eliot agreed to come to the Oxford Real Farming Conference to share his story today. So without further ado, I have the great pleasure of introducing Eliot Coleman.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. Since most of you don't know anything about me, I thought I would quickly show you some pictures. Our farm is surrounded by spruce and fir forest. We do a lot of work by hand. It isn't quite big enough to have a transplant machine. We do a lot of different crops, and we try and set them up so they're efficient to harvest. This is for peas. What do I point this at? The ceiling? Okay. We farm intensively. There are 12 rows of carrots on a 30-inch bed there. We try and grow and market crops that are as beautiful as possible. We try and do them exactly the way customers would like to find them. These are one of our signature crops, baby carrots with the tops left on that we harvest all winter. We grow in a lot of greenhouses because our winters are far colder than yours. It'll go down to 20 below 0 Fahrenheit. And we use them in the summer because we're near the ocean and our summers are very cool, so it's the best way to grow the heat-loving crops. We use them in the fall, in the spring, and we get rid of weeds in them by irrigating them thoroughly, laying down a sheet of plastic like this and closing up the greenhouse. It's called solarizing. It's done out of doors in warm countries like Israel. It works extremely well in a cold climate like ours with the greenhouse as the outer layer. In the winter, we still keep using the greenhouses, but rather than expending money on heat, we've learned that if we put a second layer, in this case fleece a foot above the ground inside the greenhouse, we can grow hardy crops all winter long very successfully. We do that by moving greenhouses over, moving them off the summer crops onto the pre-planted winter crops, and we've worked out ways to make the greenhouses easy to move. We make a lot of compost. We have no fancy equipment. We don't turn it. We find that if we leave it for a year and a half, it produces a much more effective compost. Since we work in the greenhouse, we've needed to make our own tools for there. We realized early on that Mr. DeWalt is a genius and has already figured out how to put all that power in there, and so we've taken advantage of it by that highly technological rope that pulls the trigger. We also have figured out to grow crops we shouldn't be able to grow. In our climate, perennials like artichokes won't make it through the winter, so we've learned how to trick them into being annuals. The caption for this picture says, "Eat your heart out, California," because we're not supposed to be able to do that. We also do funny things like we grow watercress inside the greenhouse under these 1 gallon a minute misters, and we end up with a very pure and clean crop. You don't have to worry about the stream it grew in. We run a lay farming system for our fertility with laying hens and pastures like this that become cropland in future years. And even in the winter, the hens get to be out on pasture, even when there is snow and ice everywhere. They live in this greenhouse on wheels. We move it 10 feet down a pasture every week. We plow the snow off in front, and they love it in there. We sell mostly retail at markets. This is a winter market we do in a large glass greenhouse in a nearby town. And we also have our own farm store that brings in crowds during the summer, even though we live in a fairly rural spot. You'll notice the sign does say real farming, real food. We changed it from organic back in 2000 when the USDA took over the word organic. I knew they were untrustworthy. I knew letting the fox manage the hen house was a bad idea. And that's why I've always liked the name of this conference, the Oxford Real Farming Conference. And this is the dress for success on the small farm. Out of the way here. Okay, first the definition. What are we talking about? I've always called it organic. When I first went to Europe, I noticed the French were calling it biologique, biological. My friend Stewart Hill at McGill University in Quebec used the term ecological. The USDA has never been able to utter the O word, so they prefer to call it low-input sustainable agriculture, which became known as the LISA program. So all the good old chemical boys in the USDA could make jokes like Lisa doesn't put out. Acres USA started out calling it cyclical farming. It's been called nature farming many places. Humus farming by Newman Turner and friend Sykes back in the old days. Miguel Altieri and Stephen Gleesman used the word agroecology, which is, they're talking about the same thing. And Bob Rodale pioneered the word regenerative, which probably is the least good of all of those. But when I first heard the word biological, biologique, at a conference in France, I remember speaking to a French farmer, and I said, oh, that's great. When I go home, I'm going to start using biological instead of organic. And he said, why are you going to do that? And I said, well, you know, whenever I talk to an agricultural scientist, when I mention the word organic, I can see his eyes cloud over and he's running for the door. And this guy said to me, quelle coïncidence, what a coincidence. That's just what happens in France when I see biologique. So I decided maybe the name wasn't important, the deeper understanding of what we're talking about. So how did a 27-year-old college literature teacher with a passion for adventure get involved in all of this 53 years ago? I read a book. The book was called Living the Good Life. It was by Scott and Helen Naring. Scott was a hardline, old-time US socialist who was always in trouble with the government. And in order to support themselves, they'd left the city and were living on a small farm in Vermont, and they wrote about their experiences. And at that time, I had a teaching job, so I could have my vacations to go adventuring. But their book made the idea of growing organically sound absolutely appealing as an adventure, mainly because everything I read said it was impossible. And as an adventurer, I was specializing in doing the impossible. So Scott and Helen sold me some of the back half of their farm. They sold me 60 acres for $2,000. $33 an acre. Scott was one of those socialists who walked their talk, and he said he'd never done anything to make the land better. so he was going to sell it what he'd paid for it. Well, the $33 an acre was probably what it was worth. It was all spruce fir forest. It hadn't been farmed for 100 years. And there were plenty of rocks, very little topsoil. And my wife and I built a small house, and we got to work, like the Nike slogan says, just do it. And so our first half acre, I cut the trees off in the winter, and then when the snow melted and the soil thawed, I got going on it. And what I did was drive in stakes and divide this land into 20-foot by 40-foot rectangles. 20 by 40 feet is 1/50th of an acre. And with a pH that we had, I was supposed to put on 50 bags of lime to the acre, so I was making my life easy. I would then redivide that into 10 by 20 foot sections, 1/4 of that. And in the course of a day's work, with a mattock and an axe and a shovel, I could turn 10 by 20 feet into something that looked like soil ready to till. And at the end of 4 days, I had the whole 20 by 40 foot thing done. And at the end of a week, I had dragged out all the stumps, rolled out all the rocks, and I had a 50th of an acre. Now, if people wonder why we have always farmed on the small scale side, that's a very good explanation of it, because I wouldn't live long enough to have turned the whole 60 acres into something like that. And because of that, because I had to start out creating the farm from nothing, I learned an awful lot about soil and how to make it fertile. And one of my neighbors back then, Bunk Smith, I live near the Atlantic Ocean, had a business shucking clams. And any day, if I showed up over at Bunk's at 3:30, he would fill my trailer with all the clamshells, and I would take them back and shovel them out into the fields and turn them in with my tiny little 4-horsepower rototiller. And the only time an extension agent, this is a government service to help farmers, the only time an extension agent ever came by our farm, he came by one day when I was doing that. And he looked at this and he said, "Eliot, that's ridiculous. Those won't break down for 100 years. And I remember thinking, isn't that the perfect metaphor for the difference between the way they think and the way I think? He's thinking, if I'm not going to get a return tomorrow, it isn't worth doing. I'm thinking that I'm putting calcium into the soil for my great-grandchildren. And that's exactly what I was doing and why it worked so well. But I remember one day, I was out there chopping and working with the mattock and sweating profusely, and a Maine neighbor came by. And my neighbors are all country people. They work really hard, but he took one look at this and he said, "By golly, Eliot, isn't that a lot of work?" And I said, "Well, Berwin, if you knew what I used to do for fun before I got into this, this really isn't work. I used to go on mountaineering expeditions and spend 3 weeks at a time living in a tent surrounded by snow and spend my days with a 70-pound pack on my back chopping steps up a vertical ice cliff to pack supplies to Camp 4. I said, compared to that, this is pretty restful. And it was, but it did take a lot of work, and it was a complete education in building soil and soil health. And so I read all the same books. We were putting in lime, we were putting in phosphate rock. Fortunately, there was a horse farm nearby, and I used to trade them vegetables for loads of horse manure. The trick we learned in turning that land into something we could farm was, as I said, it was a spruce fir forest. And most of the trees, since it had last been cleared, had grown up to about 6 inches in diameter. The fir trees are pretty much junk trees in Maine. They're balsam firs. They make a wonderful Christmas tree, nice smell to them, but they aren't long-lasting and they aren't useful for much. The spruce trees are better. And the difference is the spruce trees have a taproot. They were a lot harder to get out. The fir trees were only shallow rooted. Well, one day we'd been there about 3 or 4 years, and a reporter from the Wall Street Journal had heard that there was this crazy guy trying to turn forest into farm in the modern world. And he wrote if he could come up and write us up, and I said sure. And so I was out there clearing the next piece of land, getting the stumps out. And to do that, I had a root axe, and I would chop in a circle all the surface roots around the tree stump. And then I'd go across this whole area doing that. Well, one thing about Wall Street Journal reporters is they do not know the difference in the bark between a fir tree and a spruce tree. And as I said, the spruce trees have a taproot. They're a lot harder to deal with. After I chopped all of these trees, I grabbed one of the firs, and if you chopped all the surface roots, you could, we left the stumps 4 feet high, so you get a purchase on this, you could tip it over. And I remember looking out of the corner of my eye, he was standing next to a spruce, and I could see he was going like this. And when the article came out in the Wall Street Journal, he wrote about Eliot Coleman ripping stumps from the soil with his bare hands. It gets better. We had a small farm store by then, by about the 4th year, and I remember I was running it that day, and I saw this car come wheeling into the parking lot, and this large Wagnerian woman got out and came striding purposefully into the stand, and I remember thinking, oh my God, I think she's just read about the giant hero of her dreams. And she came up to me, she was just so excited. She said, I want to meet Eliot Coleman, the man who pulls stumps with his bare hands. I drew myself up to my full 5'8", looked her in the eye, and I said, I'm Eliot Coleman. It is my fondest hope when I finish today that I do not see on any of your faces that same look of abject disappointment that I saw on hers. As we cleared more land, we needed to be a little more efficient at getting all the roots and stuff out. And the area where I am, there's really no farming there anymore. There might have been 100 years ago, but there isn't. But I had a neighbor whose mailbox was supported by this wonderful old plow, like one of these things you would plow the prairies with. So I made a deal with him, and we went over and put in a post for his mailbox and borrowed the plow. And so we wrestled all the stumps out, but there are all the roots and everything in there. And we hooked that up behind my farm equipment, which happened to be a 1948 Willys Jeep left over from the war. And with me holding this thing and somebody driving the Jeep, we actually did a pretty good job of ripping everything out of the next acre that we were working on. But the trouble was, there was nothing to do after that, because since there was no farming near me, there were no disc harrows or anything to use. My predecessor on this land 100 years ago had built a cellar hole with large chunks of local mined granite, and he'd left one that was about 10 feet long and a foot by a foot by a foot in the remains of a pile by the edge of the property. So I went out, backed the Jeep in there, got a chain on it, dragged it out of the woods, hooked it up on a diagonal behind the Jeep, and drove with that heavy granite block back and forth across the field. That was my harrow. The reason I like that is I've always been fond of what I call the 30-cent solution. You can always get it done. Nothing is impossible. You just have to figure out how. And at about the time I was doing all this, there was a group in Massachusetts called the New Alchemy Institute, who were early explorers of the new natural agriculture. And they built up in Prince Edward Island this huge greenhouse complex thing to raise fish and vegetables called the Ark. And I remember going to presentation, and they showed slides of this, of the building and the area around it. And I raised my hand and asked a question, and I said, how much did that cost? And they said, oh, we raised $300,000. And if you looked at the picture, they disturbed about an acre around this building, and they were only a couple of 100 yards from the ocean on Prince Edward Island. And I said, do you realize that any good peasant with a hoe could raise more vegetables on the area disturbed around there, and give that peasant a fishing rod, and he or she could catch more fish in the ocean than you're raising in the tanks in there? What did you get for $300,000? And the answer was, next question, please. The thing was that it is perfectly possible to farm as economically as possible, even if you start with nothing, like we did, by just looking around and seeing what's there. The area where I live, since it's near the ocean, has become a summer colony. And the reason we were lucky to get land from the Nearings is the old farms have all been bought up by summer people, and it's very expensive. You can't afford them. But in order to maintain the farm look, they hire a local contractor every summer to come in and mow the fields. Well, I'm a smart boy. I used to, when I would run into him, occasionally mention how dangerous it was to leave all that dry, flammable material on the ground around their houses. And darned if they didn't hire me to clean it up. We used to make pure grass compost. It took about 2 years to turn into compost, but this was all coming locally, and it worked very well. The biggest problem we had back then was deer, because we were in the woods. And we learned one of the tricks was to have a battery radio tuned to an all-night talk show. Music didn't work. The deer quickly figured out music. But an all-night talk show, I would walk by and I would think, oh my gosh, there's two guys standing out in my field. And so we finally got modern on that once, because I read that there were now these special things with electric eyes and motion sensors that, when they were triggered, gave out a mountain lion scream. And this was determined to chase deer away. And I don't know if it ever worked on deer, but I forgot where it was. And I wandered by one night, and let me tell you, I must have jumped 3 feet in the air. So anyway, this is all going on, but despite all of our, what we thought was great success, the ag experts were still telling us that it was impossible. But how had I gotten inspired in all this? When I first read the Nearing's book, I was living in New Hampshire, just north of where Dartmouth University is. And I used to go down to their library. And back then, libraries were on the Dewey Decimal System, and agriculture went from 630.0 to 635. And I went back into the stacks every time I came there, and I just read my way across the shelf. Organic farming is not a revolution, it is a rediscovery. The books I read, Selman Waxman's Soil Microbiology and Selman Waxman's Humus, talking about the importance of organic matter in the soil. Krasilnikov, a Russian, Soil Microorganisms and Higher Plants, absolutely fascinating stuff. Leonard Wickenden, an American chemist who retired to his home in Connecticut, started gardening, found organic worked, and suddenly wrote the best books ever, putting down all the naysayers. F.H. King, Farmers of 40 Centuries, exceptional. And a wonderful man named Cyril Hopkins, who happened to be the director of the Illinois State Experiment Station back in 1910, and writing pamphlets telling farmers there was no sense in their buying nitrogen when there were 70,000 tons of nitrogen over each acre of their land, and all they had to do was grow clover. So none of this was new information. Even back in 1910. The reason you've never heard of Cyril Hopkins was because he wasn't offering anybody something to sell. And then there was the 1938 US Department of Agriculture Yearbook of Soils. If you can ever find a copy of that in the library, they put out a yearbook every year. It was entitled Soils and Men. And I could reprint that today as an organic farming textbook. Articles about green manures, cover crops, crop rotations, mixed farming with livestock, everything that has become part of the organic world. And then once we bought land from the Nearings, Scott Nearing had the most wonderful library of all the books that came from here. And these were truly my mentors. P.H. Hainsworth, Agriculture, A New Approach. Back then, Faber and Faber was publishing all the organic books for anybody who wanted to write them. And I got to read Albert Howard's Agricultural Testament and The Soil and Health. Robert Eliot's Clifton Park System of Farming. It's the idea that during this period, people had the idea you couldn't farm this way is just unbelievable. George Stapleton's Lay Farming, that's still one of my favorite books, and what is the system behind all the fertility on our farm at present. And then there were three wonderful women. The first was Lady Eve Balfour, The Living Soil. This was the first book written about organic farming with scientific citations in it. And back in the 70s, I set up a number of farm tours to bring Americans over to see what was going on in Europe, because you guys were way ahead of us in organic farming back then. And we would be on the continent, we would be here in England, and the people who came along, there's certain books written about organic farming that suggest that all of the inspiration in the UK came from the conservatives. Well, in the US, all the inspiration was coming from the hard left wing, and everybody who came along on those farm tours was definitely hard left wing. A guy on one of them I remember well had fought against Franco in the Spanish Civil War with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and he was running a community farm program in Denver. And I happened to be sitting next to him when we were at a pub in London. And the Soil Association people, including Lady Eve Balfour, came to meet with us and talk to us. And Lady Eve moved around the room. We were sitting at different tables, and she came and sat at our table. Well, let me tell you, all these young guy farmers were just blown away by this woman who could knock back the Guinness as fast as we could, but also could speak encyclopedically about organic farming. I mean, it was just amazing. And she got up to go sit at another table, and this hardcore old leftist sitting next to me turned to me and said, "Damn, if that's the aristocracy, I think there should be more of them." A second of the amazing women was Dalziel O'Brien. She wrote a book entitled Intensive Gardening. Her real name was Rosa D. O'Brien, but back then people named Rosa did not write books about organic farming, so she wrote as R. Dalziel O'Brien. And she had a fantastic market garden, very efficient, motion study and everything, all run with compost. But then you get down to the favorite little book, because it is a little book, and it's entitled From Vegetable Waste to Fertile Soil by Miss May Bruce. Now, people on our side of the ocean consider that England is peopled by a collection of slightly odd eccentrics. And if you saw Miss May Bruce's book, you would have thought the same thing. What I saw was the incredible enthusiasm and determination it took to start the movement over here, to start the movement that resulted in the Soil Association and all of the information that inspired me so much. So I had that background, and we decided we were going to figure out what was going on here on our own. The first year we were on our place, we grew 40-pound cabbages. Now, at that same time, I read about a group up at experimental thing in Findhorn who had said the same thing. The first year, they grew 40-pound cabbages, and they decided that Pan was showing off and whatever was going on. Not wanting to start a religion, I sent soil samples up to the university, and I found out that when you first lime a sandy acid soil, which is exactly what we had, the very first year nitrogen cuts loose like mad. You can't reproduce it the second year. Well, we continued in that same thing. We wanted to know how to create fertility for different crops. And we would take a field and put in a strip of horse manure, a strip of seaweed, a strip of autumn leaves, and a strip of compost. And then in the spring, we would cross-plant all our vegetables. This was just a fantastic learning experience because there were things like beets, celery, crops that liked all the extra trace minerals. Boy, they loved the seaweed. The brassica family, cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, didn't like the seaweed. They did okay in the horse manure, but they loved autumn leaves. When I sent a sample of the soil from that plot, it turns that just turn under autumn leaves, and they have a lot of nitrogen stored in them, and as they decompose over winter, they kick that loose the next year. So that was fascinating. The following year, we had strips of oak leaves, maple leaves, birch leaves, beech leaves. Now, back when I was doing this, anybody who was an organic farmer was considered to be pretty darn strange. And our neighbors thought we were even more eccentric oddballs when we would arrive with our Jeep and trailer and say, "Can we rake up just your birch leaves over there?" Well, we did, and we'd get oak leaves here, and we put all this together. And it turned out oak leaves, despite all the worries about acid and everything, they had more stuff in them than anything else. They were an amazingly good soil improver. Then we would take another field the next year, and we'd till a strip and mulch a strip and deep aerate a strip with a broad fork and have a no-till strip and run across there. And this was just running our own experiment station and learning how it worked. When we wanted to get even fancier, we would have noticed which different mixtures grew the healthiest plants, and we would then plant the exact same crop in 2 fields side by side, fertilized differently. And darn if there weren't pests on it in the one we had purposely done wrong, and no pests in the one we had done right. So this was going on for many years, and what fascinated me and continued to was there was no interest from conventional agriculture. I used to go up to the university and talk to people, and in the 53 years I've been on that farm, no entomologist from the University of Maine has ever come down to visit our farm. When I was up at the university, I would try and talk the agricultural professors. And if I mentioned rock powders, I was talking about phosphate rock, granite dust, basalt float and everything. I remember this one guy said, "Well, that's ridiculous. Rock powders will never work." And then I remember him pausing and remembering that he'd just recently spread lime on his fields and having a double take. And then I was up there again. There was one professor who was slightly more open-minded than the others, and I was talking to him, and another one came by, and the slightly friendly professor said, "Gee, Eliot's doing some pretty interesting stuff. I think maybe we want to get him up here to do a presentation." And the unfriendly one said, "What? Everybody knows that's snake oil, and it's foolish." And I have enough of an education that I don't let these people intimidate me. And so I looked him in the eye and I said, "Oh, Professor Smith, would you be so kind as to share with us the data upon which you base that statement?" And he said, well, there isn't any data. Nobody's ever been foolish enough to investigate this. And I said, I see, Professor Smith, is that the usual standard of academic inquiry here at the university? Anyway, these people were so scared of what we were doing. There's a wonderful cartoon character in America named Pogo. He is a very philosophical cartoon muskrat. He lives in the Okefenokee swamp. His most famous quote is, "We have met the enemy and he is us." But Pogo also had another great quote, and it is, "We are faced with insurmountable opportunities." And somehow, conventional agriculture was faced with insurmountable opportunities. So my continued inspiration and learning. I came over with a group of Americans. We wanted to visit Hawley, the Soil Association farm, and we arranged it, and we got there, and this nice man was going to give us a tour. And he took a look at the fact that this was all Americans, all colonials. And he started out by telling us that New Bell's Farm, which is where the Hawley experiment was built in 1400. Take that, you newcomers. And we were dutifully impressed. And then he paused for that just perfectly timed pause that certain people are so good at. And just to rub it in deeper, he said, "Old Bell's Farm was built in 1200. We were dutifully impressed. I came over to a conference in Paris in 1974, and that was really an eye-opener. The group in France called Nature and Progress, Nature et Progrès, had put it together. And on the farm tour before, I went to visit this small farm just outside of Paris, run by a man named Louis Savier, and it was really the inspiration for the way I farm. It was so tidy, it was so efficiently done, the neat rows, the crops glowing with health, the compost, everything, and that was the beginning of my understanding how well this could be done. But I also got to hear a lecture from Francis Chabousseau, a French agricultural researcher who had written a book about the fact that insects only bother sick plants. Now, that idea was so far from the tongues of agricultural researchers in the US at that point that it was just amazing. This guy from the French agricultural research, and he gave this talk, and I went up to him afterwards, and I said, "Wow, that's amazing that you would talk about plant health affecting the relationship to insects." And he looked at me, he said, "Why? Doesn't everybody know that?" Well, everybody didn't know that, but I had always thought it was the most fascinating idea in organic agriculture. And so I had been looking into it for years, and back in the end of the 19th century, there was a movement called Predisposition. And the predispositionists held that insects could not maintain, or diseases maintain hold on a plant unless the plant had been somehow predisposed, health-wise, negatively predisposed. And this was a major theory at the time. If you wonder where Sir Albert Howard picked that up, one of the two leading predispositionists was a man named H. Marshall Ward, who happened to have been Howard's leading professor at Cambridge when Howard was studying there. And Howard's wife, in one of her books, says that that was where the idea came from. To me, it is the most significant idea in organic farming because I have a feeling that nature is consistent. And if the way I prepare the soil results in a plant in full health, one would then assume that eating that plant might result in human beings in full health, which I 100% believe. And on that trip, I met all sorts of European farmers, and they were doing really intelligent things. Their soil disturbance was only in the top 5 to 10 centimeters. They were quickly planting a mixed species green manure. The Germans called it Landsberger Gemenge, Landsberger mix. And it consisted of 2 legumes, 1 grass, and 1 brassica. And I remember being on a German farm and seeing the carrot harvester going down the field, harvesting the carrots, and right behind it came a tractor pulling a drill, putting in the green manure. It was pretty impressive. I learned a lot on those trips about good living. We visited a farmer. He invited us for lunch. And before lunch, we went down in his root cellar, and he had his wine cellar. And he had wines from all different farmers. And I said, you mean farmers like you who are raising livestock and vegetables also grow grapes and make wine? He said, of course. And on another trip, this was great. We were in Normandy, and I asked the concierge at the hotel if there were any farmers around who still spread seaweed on their fields, like in the old days, because we did. We were near the coast. And she said she knew of one. She phoned him up, asked him if I could come visit, and he said, yes, I could. So I got over there, and it looked just like my place. It was so beautiful. We became instant friends. And 5 minutes later, we're sitting in his kitchen drinking his hard cider. And I remember saying, wow, this is good. How do you make this? He said, I just take my apples to the cider mill. And I said, is that far? And he said, mais non. Doesn't every village have a cider mill? Well, shortly after that, we were even better friends. And he brought out his Calvados. And this was extra special. And I said, wow, how do you make this? He said, I just take my cider to the distillery. And I said, is that far? And he said, mais non. Doesn't every village have a distillery? This is great. So that inspired me to set up farm tours of Europe so Americans could come over and not only learn about farming, but learn about the fact that farming and the life of the farm and the benefits of the farm were so fantastic. And I ran them in 1976 and 1977. We would bring over 27 people, rent 3 Volkswagen buses, 9 people per bus, drive around. European friends helped me set up all the schedules. And these were really eye-opening tours. And because of that, I got a phone call in the summer of 1979. And it was from the US Department of Agriculture. They said, we've heard you know something about organic farming in Europe. And I said, yes. And he said, well, could you help us? It turned out that the then Commissioner of Agriculture, USDA Commissioner of Agriculture, had gone home at Christmas, invited his neighbors over for a party, and one of his neighbors, and this is very important, who was a very conservative Republican, told him that he had started organic farming 6 years before, and the farm had never been better, and everything was successful, and this stuff really works. Well, this is Bob Berglund, and Berglund went back to DC and said to the Department of Agriculture, gee, we need to look into this. So they assigned a study team and asked me if I could tell them about what was going on in Europe, and I said, better than that, I'll set up a tour for these guys. So we had a 10-day tour, and they sent along a soil specialist, a compost specialist, a sociologist, and the dean of the Department of Entomology at a major American university who was on loan to them. And the day I remember, we were visiting a farm of a German named Ernst Weichel. Weichel had his own factory making farm equipment for organic farming, but he also had a fantastic farm. And we were talking to Weichel through the interpreter on the side of the field. And the entomologist wandered out into the field like entomologists do, bending over and sweeping his hand across the top of the crops out there. And it was a multi-species vegetable field. And after a couple of minutes, we noticed that he was no longer moving. He was just standing there in stunned silence. And we looked over at him, and he said to us, "We can't do this well with chemicals." I never thought the man was the same again. And when we left at the end of that day, he went up to Weichel, and he told him that he had learned more in that one afternoon than at any of the conferences he ever went to. The study came out, Report and Recommendations on Organic Farming, and it was incredibly positive. And it resulted in the USDA putting in an Office of Organic Farming. That was under the Carter administration. The report came out in the spring of 1980. Reagan administration was in there by 81. After 2 months in office, they canceled the organic farming office. And so, yeah, this is the same USDA that we were told back in the year 2000 was going to be in charge of organic farming and certification. As I said, I never certified, never wanted to do anything to do with it because I knew they were the wrong people to put in charge, and they have proven very much to be the wrong people to be in charge. When they finally came out with their suggestions for what organic certification should be, they included irradiation, sewage sludge, and genetically modified organisms at the behest of industry. There was such an outroar from the American public, the first time they'd ever gotten 350 letters on an issue, that they backed off on those and gave up on that. But when the final rule came out in 2000, it was quite obvious that they were not on track with where they needed to be. And it's gotten worse since. And so a lot of grain growers in the US are being put out of business by all the illegal, non-organic, supposedly certified organic by somebody in Malta grain that is coming in. The dairy farms all over the US, the small, honest family dairy farms, are being put out of business by huge concentrated animal feeding operations, supposedly organic dairy farms with 20,000 cows in the same barn, and all they're doing is feeding organic grain, which is probably illegal because it's coming in illegally, and this is putting out of business so many real dairy farmers. And eggs, the same thing. Small egg producers are getting put out of business. It was something I wasn't paying all that much attention to, except being outraged, until we learned only a few years ago that the USDA was allowing hydroponic vegetables to be certified as organic, and had been since about 2010. We had no idea of this. Well, we have been raising a real storm on this, but the difficulty is that the people doing it are making so much money, and actually they control the press and the thinking and everything. And my best story about the frustration when someone else is controlling the press and the thinking was actually uttered by President Lyndon Johnson when he thought the press was against him. And Johnson said, "If I were to get up tomorrow morning and walk on the surface across the Potomac, that afternoon the paper would say, 'President can't swim.'" Well, that's basically what you run into when the bad guys control that. And this has been a very difficult battle. The USDA is not budging. We've put together a group called the Real Organic Project, because this should be important to you because of the exchange that organic has between our side of the Atlantic and yours. If we certified it, it can be sold here. If you certify it, it can be sold over on our side. And There is so much fake stuff involved now. Am I mainly bothered by the fact that this is illegal? The fact that economists have a word for what's going on. It's called stealing. But what really bothers me is the confusion in people's mind that anything like these CAFOs or hydroponic could actually be organic, because organic is what farming is, what is going to feed the world in the future. It is the only system of farming that has proven itself dependable and sustainable and able to continue feeding us for years to come. So the idea of confusing that with hydroponic bothers me greatly. We have discussed giving up on the word organic. We haven't done it yet, but you know, we put an awful lot of our lives into this, but it's discouraging. But the other night at a beer-fueled discussion, we came up with, okay, maybe there is a chance here if we had the ideal new name. Okay, we're going to get rid of organic, but we're talking about biological agriculture. B-I-A-G-R-A. Bi-agra we came up with. And then we thought, oh my gosh, put the organ back in organic. A new high in sustainability. When we institute that, I will be sure to immediately let you all know. Thank you very much.
Eliot, an amazing talk. We're nearly out of time, but we've got time for a few questions. So if I can have a show of hands for questions, and then we'll take a few. Anyone? Patrick. Oh, it's a microphone coming.
Eliot, it's Patrick Holden.
Hi, Patrick.
You first came to Cirencester. You missed that later part of the history of your relationship with the United Kingdom. Do you remember that bit where you came to the Cirencester conference in, was it 1982?
I came and spoke at Cirencester in 2000.
No, you came earlier
Oh,
than
in
that.
'82, that's right, the first time, yes.
Why did you leave that bit out?
Just in case you don't know, Patrick is as famous over on our side of the Atlantic as he is here. He's always, so you had a question, I'm sorry.
My question is related to standards, because don't you think that by defining organic farming as this side of the line is organic and that side of the line is not organic, we set ourselves up for a fall, because you will attract an equal and opposite group of people, some who say the standards are being diluted and others who say the standards are too high, and you end up with an argument which cannot be resolved. So my question is, do you agree that that is one of the problems of defining a standard which is either a, you know, yes, it isn't, or no, it isn't?
There was a United States Supreme Court justice named Porter Stewart. And when the Supreme Court was discussing pornography and trying to come up with a definition of it, Porter Stewart's quote was, "I know it when I see it." And that is my quote for organic. It's quite obvious to anybody, like all of us who are involved in this Real Organic project, that there are, I don't want to call them standards, but there are things you want to gain by farming a certain way. And the only ones I would call organic are the things that gain that, like sustainability and long-term soil health and so forth. And did we set ourselves up for a fall by certifying in the first place? Prior to the USDA getting involved, and I suspect the EU getting involved also, there were small groups certifying. When I first came over here, La Mer Boucher, Nature Progrès, Bioorganic, all certified. In fact, there was a Swiss supermarket named Migros that had their own little thing called Migros Organic or something like that. And these different programs all had their own certification, and it left it up to the customer to decide how pure they wanted their food to be, because the biodynamic was considered the top. And I think if we had stuck with that and allowed different groups with different philosophies to define it, and then let the customers decide which of those stores they wanted to shop at, we wouldn't have the situation we have now.
Time for one more, very quickly. No hands. This gentleman over here. Do you want to just wait for the microphone?
So would your conclusion be basically trying to keep government as far away as possible?
Can you translate that?
So can you repeat that? Sorry.
Sorry. Would your conclusion be basically government really shouldn't get involved and leave it to the people?
Should government get involved?
Who should get involved?
Should government get involved?
Oh yeah, the good question. Should government get involved in these things? At the time the US organic people let the government get involved, they didn't really feel they had the wherewithal and funding to do it themselves. And they probably didn't, and they shouldn't have. They should have allowed the simple individual systems in each state, here it might be each county, to continue doing what they had been doing so well. And so no, getting the larger body involved, I think, was a great mistake, because all governments are corrupt, and it has been shown endlessly.
Thank you very much, Eliot. Sadly, we're out of time, but Eliot is taking part in one other session tomorrow on tools for small-scale farmers. That's at 12 o'clock in the old library, which I'm sure will be a fascinating session. I wanted to take this opportunity to thank Eliot again for his talk today, and also to Chelsea Green Publishing, who have made his visit to the UK possible. Eliot and Steve Gabriel are doing some book signings, I believe, after this session over on the Chelsea Green stand, so you can catch up with him there. Thank you very much.